I'll try not to.
It's a big bill, so we want to make sure, as
Right.
with the staff presentation, that we are understanding its intent and what it's going to do.
First of all, thank you, Senator Darnielle, as chair of this committee, and all the members for your interest and attention. It is a big bill, and I want to thank Kevin for summarizing the bill that's before you. It's the result of 3 decades of conflict that have finally gotten resolved. It's an amazing process to sit at the table for 18 months, which is what the parties did, and share and discuss in a civil way the different perspectives and concerns that we all had. The process was guided by the center at UW called the Ruckelshaus Center, and it was a very slow but steady and ultimately successful process. So I just want you to know that this did not happen overnight. This happened over months and months of meetings. But in the end, we gave you a report that Kevin referred to, and I have a copy here for you, that was signed off by Senator Braun and myself, Representative June Robinson, and Representative Chris Corey. Terry Anderson, representing the Friends of Fircrest, Jeff Carter, representing the Friends of Rainier, Matt Zuvich, representing the Washington Federation of State Employees, Lindsay Grad, representing the Service Employees, Sue Elliott, representing the ARC, Julia Bell, representing the Developmental Disabilities Council, as well as Bill Moss, Assistant Secretary of Aging and Long-Term Support, Amber Leaders from the Governor's Office, and Evelyn Perez, the Developmental Disabilities Administrator. We all sat at the table for 18 months, meeting at least once a month, and we got to a real agreement on how to rethink the way we care for our clients who have intellectual and developmental disabilities.
The one thing about Bill is that he takes the world seriously. He takes this country seriously. He takes patriotism seriously, but he doesn't take himself that seriously. To understand Bill, you have to understand Jill and the relationship between them. She's the glue. She's the one that made possible all of the moves that he's made in life and in the course of raising 5 children. And it's always been Jill, and she also is an intellectual heavyweight in her own right. One thing about Jill is she gets to the heart of an issue very quickly. She's got a very incisive mind. It's quite acute. She's been in conversations way ahead of her time and how she approached issues and how she thought they would be solved and how they should be addressed. She is an inspiration for him and someone that he shares issues with. So when you think about it, you can't think of Bill alone. You've got to think of Bill and Jill. Bill's career following law school, he started practice with the family and then almost immediately ran for the state legislature and became the Speaker of the Indiana House quickly. So both the scale and the intelligence and the passion of the man burns through, and that's how you go very quickly from a private citizen and a law student to a leadership role in government. He ran for the Senate at a very difficult time against Birch Bayh. He didn't win, but he came very, very close to winning. And then he went into the executive branch. And Bill's career has followed a public service orientation all the way through. And it's that public service that tells you about a quality you might not immediately recognize, which is his patriotism. He is a deeply profound patriot. Bill has read all the history of the Constitution. He's read a biography of every president of the United States. Can you imagine staying awake through a Millard Fillmore biography?
Downtown St. Louis was so blacked out by a dense fog and smoke that visibility was limited to 50 yards.
Of the 41 industries discharging directly into the Cuyahoga, 19 bear the onus of having been singled out for inadequately treating their wastes.
Everybody is downwind or downstream of somebody else.
Los Angeles has been plagued with a smog which irritates the eyes.
When we started back in 1970, the newspapers, television, radio was so negative. Everything was falling apart. What's happening to the rivers that catch on fire? Why is it difficult to see the mountains in Denver or people, for that matter, in Los Angeles? EPA started out responsive to the public demand that something be done to clean up the environment and protect their health.
He's a strong believer in rational systems and the rule of law, and it all fits a pattern. And that's why he was so successful at the Environmental Protection Agency, because he had this appreciation for the outdoors and for nature and for the kind of world that we want to live in. At the same time, he knew there has to be rules in order to make that work. Bill demonstrated how democracy should work. I mean, when he was confronted with the request from the White House to fire the Watergate prosecutor, first Elliot Richardson and then Bill said that in conscience we can't do that. And so his conscience was the controlling factor, and that's what makes democracy work. And you can have all the laws, and he's a profound believer in the laws, but unless you bring that personal element of your values into it, it doesn't work. The Ruckelshaus Center is another element of that. It's a form of public service, of public commitment, persuading the University of Washington and Washington State to allow them to proceed with something that is a way of settling disputes, of bringing rational elements into play.
That's where the role of the universities comes in. That's where the role of these processes that define collaboration can come in, because you really are doing your job as a legislator, for instance, if you're willing to collaborate, willing to compromise. And that's such a bad word today with so many people in the legislature. that it's hard to do. I guess I'm most proud of the fact that I'm still willing to do that, because I don't think you get problems solved if you insist it's your way or the highway. People just won't solve them.
All the things we do in life, public service is the most important thing. And Bill, I'm sure, would acknowledge that. Take all of the high points of his life. When he was in public service, he was most fulfilled and he was doing the most important things for his country.
The Honorable William D. Ruckelshaus.
One of the most honored things that can be awarded in this country is the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And President Barack Obama selected Bill as one of the awardees of it, and in recognition of his multifaceted career.
There are problems which we ought to be able to solve with reasonable compromises. And we're having a terrible time doing it. So looking for different ways to make our democracy work is very important. And using the principles of collaborative decision-making, we've found that you can move some pretty knotty problems forward and actually solve them.
I don't think Bill will ever finish all the things that he wants to do in life. He's done so much, but there's still things that he thinks about that he'd like to get done and like to do. So there's a lot of work left to be done. I'm Jerry Grinstein, and it's my privilege to welcome you to the 10th Annual Ruckelshaus Circle Luncheon. A lot has changed in the 1 year since we had this predecessor luncheon, but the goal is the same, and that is to support the Ruckelshaus Center and to do it in a way that continues the memory and the work and the life and career of Bill Ruckelshaus. The Ruckelshaus Center was Bill's idea of a way of solving public problems that needed to be addressed, but doing them without the contention and the rivalry and the collision that comes. And it's better done with collaboration and with processes that identify the goals and not focus on the problems. And it's worked amazingly well, first in Wyoming and now in the state of Washington, sponsored by WSU and the University of Washington. So the first mission today, and it's part of a trifecta, is this luncheon supports the Ruckelshaus Center. The second piece of it is, this is the 50th anniversary of the Environmental Protection Administration. And this is the first time that we've had these two former administrators work with the panel. These two are among Bill's very favorite people. They are Lisa Jackson and Bill Reilly. Bill was the first and founding EPA administrator. And then when it got in a state of disrepair during the early part of the Reagan administration, Bill was called back. These two, Lisa Jackson and Bill Reilly, are also active in what's called the EPN, the Environmental Protection Network. And they are working to restore its attention to clean air and clean water and to the goals of the EPA when there's a change of administration, to get back to the direction and the course that EPA was on. The third part today, to complete the trifecta, is the moderator of that panel is Mary Ruckelshaus, Bill's daughter. And Mary is a world-class scientist, environmental activist, and scholar, and faculty member at major universities. She knows the field and is well-spoken and is clear thinking about it as anyone could be. And I hope she will steer at least some of this discussion in the direction of what is the future of EPA, because Bill would love to have heard that. Finally, I'm happy to announce that the board has created a matching fund. Any gifts given in the course of this luncheon or shortly thereafter, very shortly thereafter, will be matched by the board up to the first $50,000. So if you've got a pen handy and some paper, write a check and send it in, and it'll be matched. If you give 500, it's 1,000. And if you give 1,000, it's 2,000, and so on. This board is committed to continuing the work that Bill envisioned. And now let me turn it over to Michael Kern, who is the director of the Ruckelshaus Center, and a fellow who has earned Bill's respect and admiration for his hard work and for the results that he's producing. And nobody knows the direction better than Michael Kern. Michael, thank you.
Thank you, Jerry, for those wonderful remarks. I'm Michael Kern, director of the William D. Ruckelshaus Center. We're so excited to be bringing all of us together today to celebrate Bill, commemorate EPA's 50th anniversary, and to hear from Lisa Jackson and William K. Reilly. I want to extend thanks to our premier sponsors, lead sponsor, sustaining sponsor, supporting sponsors, and members of the Ruckelshaus Circle. Their names have appeared on the screen today, on the event website, and in event emails. We are so grateful to them. This is the first time I haven't had to ask an audience to hold its applause until I got through mentioning all the sponsors. But now, please applaud so loudly in your home that the neighbors will wonder what's going on. These sponsors deserve it. I also want to thank all the elected and appointed officials and university leaders who are attending this event today. Thank you for your service and your leadership. To all the first responders and essential workers who are attending today, or who are too busy responding and working today and are going to have to watch this later, we all owe you a debt that we can never fully repay. It certainly has been a remarkable spring and summer of adjusting to new circumstances, working remotely, using technologies that, while not a substitute for face-to-face interaction, have allowed us to continue our important work. Put simply, that work is helping people work together in order to govern more effectively. Has that mission ever been more important? Forgive me if I answer my own question. It has not. The Ruckelshaus Center's unique ability to help public, private, non-governmental organizations collaborate will be essential to our society in addressing the unprecedented challenges that we're facing. Conflict, stalemate, dysfunction in policymaking, they've gone from being disruptive and disappointing to downright dangerous. Our expertise brings together the resources of two great universities to increase collaborative capacity among individuals and organizations, enabling them to think differently, to challenge unproductive patterns, and to be more creative. The center has a 15-year track record of success, and it's being tapped to help parties reach resolution on issues ranging from criminal sentencing, behavioral health, land use planning, salmon recovery, developmental disabilities, hazards and disaster science, and others. Leaders are also asking about our ability to help them identify lessons being learned from responses to, recovery from, and resilience in the face of COVID-19. An exciting development this year was the completion of a strategic visioning process that we call Ruckelshaus 3.0. It describes the next generation of work needed to effectively pursue our mission and achieve Bill Ruckelshaus's long-term vision. We need your help to create a larger network for collaboration across the public dialogue. On behalf of the Ruckelshaus Center's faculty and staff, thank you so much for supporting our work and being part of this special event. Speaking of special, I am humbled to have the honor of transitioning us to this event's focus, the past, present, and future of environmental protection, by introducing none other than our beloved Bill Ruckelshaus himself, who shared his thoughts on that theme last year in a video keynote for American University and the EPA Alumni Association. Interviewing Bill for that video ended up being among the last of many hundreds of conversations that the two of us shared, and it will therefore always be among my cherished memories. We would like to share a small excerpt from that conversation. I'll see you again at the end of the program. Thanks.
The Environmental Protection Agency was formed to preserve and enhance the quality of America's most precious assets, our air, land, and water. With your leadership and the assistance of EPA's fine career professionals, and with a good working relationship with state and local environmental agencies, I'm confident we will accomplish our goal, the protection of the health and well-being of the American people.
How we got here is a really important question to understand if we're going to do the right things about making our program work better and be more effective at the national and state and local level. EPA has had a major role in solving one of the global problems, the ozone hole, which was lobbied through what's called the Montreal Protocol. The world came together, signed this protocol, and effectively banned chlorofluorocarbons. Now, doing that for carbon and its impact on the climate, which it seems to me the scientists have overwhelmingly said is going to need to be done. If you don't conclude today that you ought to do something about climate change, that we ought to take serious steps to reduce carbon, to reduce the greenhouse gases, so that these problems of fires and storms and the threat to humankind that represents, our failure to do something about it today dooms us in the future. We don't believe today that there's enough of a threat to natural systems. We don't understand how those natural systems contribute to prosperity and economic growth and purposeful life. We certainly have had this tribal phenomenon that exists in politics today. If you're concerned about climate change and you see that as a real problem coming at us in the future and faster than we thought, if you look at these hurricanes on the East Coast, fires on the West Coast, that's exactly what the scientific models predict will happen as climate change becomes a more severe problem. The use of natural capital is going to have a cost associated to it. We've got to understand that cost. We've got to all work together to ensure that progress is made on protecting public health and the environment. But at the same time, we don't want to wreck the economy. We want the economy to continue to prosper, which is necessary for natural capital and all of its other manifestations to work. Anything to do with politics here, it shouldn't have. The opposite of that is work together and move toward the same objective. We've simply got to step up and do something about it. We used to be leaders. The government shouldn't see itself as the powerful unit telling everybody else what to do. It should see itself as the orchestrator of constant progress so that the poor health and bad environment is gradually getting better until you look back 40, 50 years later, which is where we are now. It's a lot better, and it's a lot better because this agency existed. And that doesn't mean that the progress is over or that we're finished. You need to cleaning up the environment is not like building a highway or painting a house. You got to stay everlastingly at it. I think we've got to work very hard at seeing this effort to improve public health and the environment as a joint effort, an effort by both the regulated and regulating community. And I think both sides can do a lot to improve that. Collaboration means you get all the people who are going to be impacted by the needed changes together and give them the authority to make changes in the law or in its implementation that will greatly enhance the possibility of success in controlling that part of pollution. It doesn't work for every problem. It doesn't work all the time for problems it ought to work for. But where it does work, it's really a wonderful thing to observe, where you get all the people sitting around a table, some of whom have been suing each other for 25 years, and saying, why can't we work together? That's what really gets me excited when I see something like that happen. When you're in a room with all these people and you see them working together and finally say, yeah, we're going to make more progress together than we are apart. So let's decide to work together.
Good afternoon. I'm Mary Ruckelshaus, sending a warm welcome from my mom and my whole family. Thank you so much for joining us today. As you've heard, my dad, Bill, was passionate about the future of environmental protection and committed to bringing both sides of the aisle together to solve problems through collaboration. It was this commitment that enabled Dad to serve as both the EPA's first and fifth administrator, where he worked to incorporate science and involve the public in informing decisions he made. In the early 1980s, Dad took a now famous step as EPA Administrator. He asked the citizens of Tacoma, those most at risk from arsenic emissions from the Asarco copper smelter, for their input on alternative regulatory measures EPA was considering. Dad asserted in a letter to the New York Times during these Asarco hearings that, quote, if public involvement in the decisions which directly affect people's lives is to be useful, two elements must be present: access to the decision maker and sufficient information to make that access meaningful, close quote. Involving the public and other stakeholders who are most affected by EPA's action or inaction truly informed decisions at Asarco and others my dad took at EPA. This simple idea recognizes that solving environmental challenges almost always involves harmonizing a constellation of values: environmental, human health, spiritual and cultural, and jobs. The Ruckelshaus Center works in much the same way as my dad's approach to solving problems, through collaboration. He believed that in bringing all parties to the table and in creating a clear and effective solution, you would create a longer, larger, and more lasting outcome for future generations. The center works to be part of Bill's legacy by carrying out his vision of effectively using collaboration to solve the tough problems of today. Now, please join me in learning more.
I'm Bob Druell, the chair of the Ruckelshaus Center Advisory Board. It's been exciting to build upon Bill's work, the universities, and the work of the center's core team and what they've created over the past year. As you've seen and heard, it's a remarkable and unique institution. But then Bill Ruckelshaus was a unique and remarkable man, a great and inspirational citizen. A solid, engaged citizenry is what Bill believed built a solid, caring, and kind country. That's what we try to do at the center, is we build upon citizenship. We bring citizens and leaders together to solve issues that are before us. It doesn't appear to be a lack of need at the moment for our services. This is why I'm so excited about the Ruckelshaus 3.0 strategic vision, where we've articulated improving the prospects for collaboration and improving them even and being engaged even beyond the Pacific Northwest. Building capacity, taking on projects, new projects and initiatives, being a thought leader, improving the political culture, increasing and engaging diversity, better engaging the next generation, and improving our message and storytelling. We can do these things, but we can't do them without additional resources. We need your help. Throughout the event, you'll see instructions on how to make a gift to the Ruckelshaus Center. A gift to the Ruckelshaus Endowment Fund or the Ruckelshaus Impact Fund helps support our work and, just as importantly, secure Bill's legacy and vision. These options to give will remain open after the event, but if you're able to give us a gift now, that would be greatly appreciated, or later, if that suits your needs better. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for helping us.
My name's Martha Kongsgaard. I am on the board of the Ruckelshaus Center, and in my 3 minutes with you, I'll do two things. Introduce our esteemed moderator, but first we'll dive in straight away to make the pitch. Throw out the ask, which is what this is. You clicked in for free, probably from home. You're still in the pants you can't stop wearing, and nonprofits still rely in great part on the generosity of friends and inspired neighbors like you. So yes, this is that crazy kabuki theater holdover from pre-COVID days when, remember, we would hurriedly leave the office to rush to the convention center to gather over the name tag table and then for lunch. How did they keep all that chicken safely at room temperature anyway, one asks in retrospect. Or better yet, for advancement, for the bottom line, we'd go home from work and insanely return downtown to gather for dinner and saliently for cocktails at the Sheraton. But we'll leave that decision for you at home this afternoon, that cocktail part. The program would commence, the right emotional tone would be reached, the lights would come up, and then someone would pop up like a bad penny like me to say the obvious. We cannot do this without you. You know we can't, so please give. Thanks in advance. The center's namesake, the moral lodestar of the region, of the country, probably would privately disapprove of this mini ask because in an important way, this is, in the end, about him, or at least about the Ruckelshausness of the center. Bill, like the center, believed that the most consequential and therefore contentious policy issues of our time could more often than not be wrestled to consensus with decency and humility, enough temperance to strip politics from the equation, but with enough passion and humor and the backing of two powerhouse universities to develop together shared durable solutions. That might sound like magical thinking, but Bill spent a lifetime in the public sphere doing just that. The center carries on that tradition and that ethic. And to the extent we get our work done here in a way that respects one another, the rule of law and nature's limits, we will be working on Bill's legacy. Thank you in advance for helping us carry on our work in these very tumultuous times. You can give by going to the link below. And for my promised second task, I'm happy to introduce to you the eponymous moderator for this afternoon's Ruckelshaus Center lunch, who is also a national treasure. She's the director of the Natural Capital Project and a professor at Stanford University, and the past lead of the Ecosystem Science Program at NOAA's Northwest Fisheries Science Center. Her list of associations and accomplishments are vast, but include serving on the Science Council of the Nature Conservancy, on the U.S. Ocean Research Science Advisory Panel, and is a founding member of the Science Advisory Board of the Puget Sound Partnership, where, lucky for me, for nearly a decade, I learned to call Dr. Mary Ruckelshaus a mentor, a sister, and a friend. Like her father, Bill, Mary believes in science, which makes her the perfect person to share a conversation with two past EPA administrators about the future of this storied and essential American institution her father founded 50 years ago. Whither the EPA, she will ask. So I hand it over to Mary, who should imagine a roaring round of applause from the crowd.
Okay, given that the theme of this event is the past, present, and future of environmental protection, let's start with the past. So Lisa, what would you say were the biggest opportunities and challenges when EPA was founded?
Oh, wow. Listen, I think, there were big challenges. The country had come together and was not happy about the state of the environment. There was air you could see, as your dad always said, there was water that would burn. And people had a real sense that we were destroying this American legacy, this amazing gift that is the United States for our future generations. And so I think the challenges were really apparent, and I think the other, you had high expectations and big challenges, and you had expectations that actions were going to start happening right away, not that, you're going to have time to set up this entity. And so it was great because a lot of people came together who were already working in health departments and public health areas, but they really needed to focus. And obviously, your dad really needed to figure out how to build something from the ground up and run it at the same time.
Mm-hmm. And Bill, why would you say that EPA's founding happened under a Republican president? It's just interesting to think about that in these days.
Earth Day 1970, which preceded by 4 or 5 months the establishment of EPA. Well, no, it didn't. EPA, yes, it did. Now I'm confusing it with the Clean Air Act. It was all 1970, and it was said on that Earth Day that if you were not a friend of the environment that day, you kept quiet about it. The culture was very green. The expectations were very high. There were 20,000 people in the streets of New York, universities, law firms, judges, professors, kids were all marching and excited and full of expectations that we were going to change the way we dealt with nature. So it made it a mandatory bipartisan issue. You had, if you were President Nixon, to, as he said, get out front, be forward leaning on that issue, even though personally he was not so experienced, immersed, or sympathetic to it. But Republicans played a very important part in the establishment of those laws. And it makes us nostalgic looking back to think that there was a time when that was true.
Yeah, that is true. That's for sure. And for Lisa and then Bill, so this question's for both of you. Was there anything unique about Bill Ruckelshaus, my dad, that was well suited to that time, to those opportunities and challenges as the first EPA administrator?
Oh yeah, he is the model and the mold. I think, first I would think impeccable integrity, established before EPA, his first stint at EPA, established again when he came back in 83. And incredible understanding and ability to put himself in the moment, but not succumb to the moment. I think it's really hard to, when you sit in this chair, Bill, I'll be curious to see what you think, but you're in the chair, you want to build and carry out the job, but you don't want to have an eye on the legacy or what they're going to say about you, because inevitably that leads to, mind games and worse, right? So he had this incredible ability to realize how important those first steps were. I was thinking about that Hamilton line, George Washington says we have to teach them how to say goodbye. He taught us that we have to set our standards high and to keep them that way. He taught us the importance of transparency. He knew that from the beginning. He knew the importance of enforcement. It's a regulatory agency. He understood the importance of science being the backbone of everything we did. And I think every administrator after him took those same three concepts, the rule of law, science, and transparency, and built a lot of their work on top of that. At least the ones that I really respect.
And how about you, Bill? How would you see that?
Well, I think of a number of things in connection with your father. I was asked yesterday, what should we look for, this by a reporter, in a new administrator? And I said, well, somebody who's got a background in the field, maybe who's been in state government or an NGO and knows the statutes. It's a complex agency and a sophisticated one. And then I laughed and said, of course, the first administrator didn't have any of that, and he knocked it out of the park. So he understood the challenge, and it was to establish right away that the place had integrity, and it wasn't just running on some dreams and headlines, and that it also was going to be a vigorous enforcer of the laws, to both respect the science and to show that you really do mean business and you're going to come down hard on polluters. He did that so early and so effectively that the country really grew to trust that agency. And that trust has really been extremely important to all of us who've succeeded him. But it was his start that created it.
I love seeing that legacy as it's gone forward through both of you and other administrators. That's a really, really important one. So for each of you, and Bill, I guess I'll ask you this one first, but Lisa, think about this question as well. I'm curious about what you would cite as EPA's top 2 or 3 achievements, just briefly in one sentence or two. And that could be either during your time or from before or after your time. But what would you say are some of the real highlights of EPA's achievements over its history?
Well, I think the one that's essential to all the others, as we were just saying, was the establishment of an independent, very aggressive regulatory body that did pay attention to the science. I think beyond that, it's sometimes overlooked, but during the downturn that took place, the Arab oil embargo and the economic challenges that we had then, it wasn't a given that this new and relatively unknown agency would thrive, would continue to be as powerful and as respected and effective as it had been, but it was. And I know that was considered Russ Strain's greatest achievement during his tenure. Beyond that, I would say the fact that the agency was able to deploy a couple of $2 billion a year for wastewater treatment plants throughout much of the 70s and 80s without fraud, without scandal, and very efficiently, I think is often overlooked. And I think it's important as we look to the future to realize that should there be the need, and I think there will be, for concomitant expenditures to deal with sea level rise, for example, and shore up cities, EPA showed that it knew how to do that. And I think we do it well. Finally, I would say that the sulfur dioxides reduction program and the elimination of acid rain from the Northeast was something that succeeded earlier and more effectively even than those of us who were proponents of it did.
Yeah, and that just led to so much confidence, like you're saying, and what smart regulation can do. So that's a great example. Yeah, thanks.
And a real hat tip to your leadership, Bill. All really good points. You know, when I was at EPA, it was over the period of time where EPA turned 40, and actually your dad came, we celebrated accomplishments, and then Time magazine, Aspen Institute did the list of the 40 greatest achievements of the EPA, and people have forgotten so many of them, from banning DDT and pesticides that were having just unknown and awful effects at the same time. You know, you mentioned the construction grants, the sewage treatment program, just the belief that it was not okay to dump our sewage into our rivers that served as our drinking water sources. Again, the environmental enforcement program, the idea that we had to come up with a way to enforce these environmental laws and delegate them down to the states and sometimes the local level. The reporting programs, one of my favorite, the Community Right to Know Act, the idea that a community has to be able to access information on what's happening. Clean cars, you know, we think about clean cars, the recycling programs. We take for granted all these programs that EPA sort of hatched and not just ideated, but implemented in a pretty short period of time. I think we should put the endangerment finding, you know, the finding in 2009 that greenhouse gases endanger public health and the environment and welfare. I think environmental justice is a really important one. EPA understood that you can't clean the environment if it's only clean for people who can afford to find a nice place to be, and how often plants and polluting sources were relegated to communities of color or poor communities or both, unfortunately. So I mean, the list goes on, but I think at its best, EPA touches every aspect of how we how we treat not just the planet, but public health, human health as well.
Yeah, it's so good to hear both of you talk and express some of those accomplishments, because you're right. I think, Lisa, it's a good point that we might otherwise take it for granted that cleaning, getting the acid rain cleaned up, what you said, Bill, and the focus on climate change as a human health risk, those took work, and they took time, and they took dedication to get those ideas put in place, like you said. So it's great to have your perspective on how far we've come and how EPA contributed to that. So Bill, moving to the present, what would you say has changed? How have environmental protection opportunities shifted, and also challenges?
Well, throughout the history of the agency, there have been periods of innovation and creativity and new legislative proposals, and then periods of reconsideration or retraction or consolidation. We are now in an era that has no precedent, that is one of radical reconsideration of the priorities, the norms, the directions, the specific foci, really, of 50 years of history, very successful history. It's as though people are looking at an extremely successful agency and taking apart the mechanisms that have made it so. Whether you look at lead or methane or the role of science or the disavowal of climate change, even when major infrastructure investments are being made, infrastructure that will last for 50 years. The idea that one doesn't take into account sea level rise expected if it's a coastal kind of bridge or road. All of these things are new. And one wonders if they will last. We have to recall that the president was elected promising to break up EPA into little pieces, and the country nevertheless did elect him. So I think we have to confess that we are not as green a country as we were. The fact that can be said, and that some of these dismemberments can take place. The agency is challenged as it never has been. Its morale could be a lot better, one can imagine. But one also has to take some comfort in the fact that the president hasn't touched the statutes. The clean air and clean water have the support of something like 85% of the country that either believe in them or want them strengthened. And that's very reassuring. So the assault has not been quite as direct as it might be, but that's that's small consolation.
I think you touched right on it, Bill. And I think looking ahead, we're in a period where government as a whole is not inspiring confidence. The ability of government to address challenges, challenges like COVID, which is another one of those big challenges that sort of comes from outside, like pollution does. It's not like we don't know where pollution comes from, but if you're in a community and you suddenly have a problem, it's like forced upon you. It almost feels as existential. And so I think the concern is that the future of human health and the environment is in, is government the place where it's going to be safeguarded? And I think those of us who, I think you would agree with me, Bill, it has to be that place. I mean, that is the role of government, is protection. Protection's in the name of the agency. It is the only agency whose sole mandate is not to take care of a sector or an industry group or promote a certain position policy-wise, other than protecting human health and the environment. And so it's incredibly important that we be successful. I also think, though, we have to look ahead to a time, to the next few years. We also see an incredibly active group of young people, not all young, some young at heart, but in general, folks who are feeling the importance of this moment on everything from racial justice, justice writ larger, climate change, climate justice. And so it also reminds me to a degree of the fact that the only people who can empower the Environmental Protection Agency are the people that EPA protects. And so I'm actually optimistic about these future leaders. I think we could be seeing, the next Bill Ruckelshauses, the next Bill Reillys, the people who are going to step up, demanding with the same urgency they did in the 60s and 70s that forced the agency to be created. And I think that gives me optimism in the face of the kind of attacks we're seeing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'd like you to, Lisa, just carry that a little bit further, because I think that's a fascinating point about how this national conversation about race and equity and social justice, how does that connect to environmental protection in general, or what might EPA's role be in that in an ideal world?
You cannot have climate change be addressed without looking at environmental justice. We know that climate change in general is going to impact places most severely in the Southern Hemisphere, Africa, Latin America, parts of Southeast Asia. It's not to say there won't be dramatic changes across the globe, but there's a justice writ large in that is, I think, for anyone with a conscience, just the migrations of people for food could completely disrupt, whole societies. And so it's sort of justice at the most fundamental level. We also know that historically, poor communities of color have borne the brunt of pollution and environmental degradation as a whole. We see COVID not affecting people equally, and part of the reason being air pollution is not equally distributed in our country, nor is asthma, and that's not a coincidence. And so we know that all the issues that, if we're really going to build a people's movement that says we have to address climate change, it has to be all the people. It's not going to work if it's not. And so the two issues are, incredibly connected. I grew up in New Orleans, at the mouth of the Mississippi, with drinking water that had hundreds of carcinogens in it by the time it reached the intakes in our city. And also a city that, was dramatically altered in 2005 by Hurricane Katrina. And then again, my friend Bill co-chaired the task force on the BP explosion and oil spill. And so, again and again, we are reminded that communities, this whole thing is about protection of communities. It comes down to people. And I think I am also really encouraged at how many young people are marching for racial equity on behalf of Black and Brown communities, because they now know and understand that they are going to have to demand equality and justice as part of the government they want.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is an inspiring thing to see. I agree.
Mary, if I could add something.
Please.
The connection that Lisa makes on environmental justice, which is a program I started EPA after exposure, particularly to the kinds of things that she's describing in various concentrated areas of pollution in the country. But something that is of great concern to me right now is the condition on Indian reservations. The Navajo reservation, I think, is one of the largest, and people are telling people there to wash their hands regularly. Half the population there has no access to running water. If you looked at the 5 major reservations as states, New York would be in, I think, 6th place in terms of percentage of people who get the virus relative to the total population size. It's really a scandalous problem, and fundamentally it's a very important environmental problem, but it's a health problem, it's an economic problem, and it's a problem, frankly, of just terrible neglect. I have not called the EPA Administrator very often in recent years, but I did call him on that particular issue. Was impressed that he knew a good deal about it, and I hope is going to find some money in this new NAFTA fund that's available to implement the new NAFTA to possibly address some of those basic infrastructure issues. And and get them at least running water.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that both of your examples just showing the complete interconnectedness and the holistic view that we need for something like human health and environmental health we hope this crisis won't go to waste, as they say. That's great that you're diving in that way, Bill. So a question for you, Bill, and then for Lisa, and then we'll turn to the future, but one more on the present. So the Ruckelshaus Center is nonpartisan, as you know, so I'm not asking for your assessment of the environmental performance of this administration or the current holder of your former office. But in terms of discussing the present of environmental protection, do you have a thought or two on what might be the most impactful developments of the past 4 years or the next 4 years? So you can think of it as what's already happened or what might happen depending on what kind of leadership we have. I'd love to hear both of your thoughts on that.
Well, you know, we have capacities that during even as recently as Lisa's time were not developed to the same degree. Artificial intelligence, the ability to use facial recognition to eliminate weeds. I have a Midwestern background and farm background, and I just love the idea of the tractor moving along with its facial recognition, spotting a weed and zapping it. And I mean, and this is not fantasy. This really exists. And the concomitant capacity to also assess nutrients in the soils, water in the soils, and possibly reduce the really heavy application of the kind of pollutants that get down through the Illinois River and Missouri River and Mississippi into the Gulf and lead to a dead zone there. I think those are going to create a lot of new opportunities for the next EPA administrator going forward. And I think they'll make a big difference. The other thing that's going to transform the country, and one hopes the agency in response, is climate change. When we begin to see cities, something like 35 of them in New Jersey alone, who have regular inundations and high tide situations, storm situations, offshore winds, regular inundations of flooding, and gradually cede space and cede housing and streets and the rest to the ocean, there's going to be a need for a more considered response that builds upon resilience. I would very much hope that EPA is central to that, and in fact leads on it. It's not inevitable that it will. There is legislation pending to create a carbon tax, but unfortunately part of it would remove EPA from the game, essentially do away with a lot of the regulations which it's thought somehow if we had carbon tax would be addressed that way. But EPA will have a very great deal to do, and I hope it's allowed to do it. I hope it's a player, and that the President recognizes that it needs to be central.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a powerful one. You're right. Lisa, how about you? What do you think about for most impactful?
I think we need a way to ensure science is built back up as the basis of EPA's work. The changes that are made on science advisory boards, the changes that have been made that allow career staff to come in and alter major documents, I think are just unacceptable. So I think it's back to basics, restoring the role of science in the agency, restoring the rule of law in the agency. I agree that if anything, EPA should be elevated going forward. And so, I would like to see a strong EPA be part of the setup from the beginning. I mean, one of the advantages we have right now, it doesn't often happen. A lot of times people think of environmental protection as costing money, but clean energy and energy efficiency we've demonstrated time and time again. We're doing it at Apple every single day. We're talking about it all the time. It's cheaper, it's cleaner, and it's cheaper. The only thing we need to do is work so that the legacy systems can be replaced in a reasonable amount of time. And we have almost all the technology we need to make a huge dent in the work that needs to go forward. So, you know, if I say to, you know, the average person, you know, I have power that's cleaner and cheaper, what do you think? They would say, okay. And it wouldn't matter. I think it's not a partisan issue. Mm-hmm. And so it's really returning the ability of technology. EPA has always been, you know, a technology forcing agency. It can't mandate protections that aren't available to be there, to be purchased, to be installed. But clean energy is cheaper. Storage is coming down in price over and over again. We're seeing that there's a return on those kinds of investments. And so, yeah, I mean, I really hope that instead of fighting this moment, fighting to preserve the old systems that are based on fossil fuel, dirty energy, we actually move in a fair and just way across the board to enable cleaner, cheaper systems.
Yeah, and those win-wins are, as you say, nonpartisan. Yeah, so thank you both so much. I have one final question for the regular part of our session today. And I know you both knew my dad. He respected both of you deeply. And you know that he was an optimist. So I'd like to end on a question about optimism and just have each of you say, what do you feel most optimistic about for environmental protection in the years to come? So Bill, do you want to start?
Well, you know, it was never a given that we would transform, the country would transform its nature protection and manage its natural resources in the way that we have, bringing back so many rivers and lakes and making Los Angeles a place that's no longer inimical to your health. All of that happened. We have cars now. I think we have 3 or 4 times as many cars as we had 40, 50 years ago. And they produce a fraction of the pollution that they did. Lisa referred to that. That is really, I think, a foundation for a very optimistic future. The country set out to do something really grand, very ambitious, and consistently through Republican and Democratic administrations, that's what it did. And we have this glorious nature to thank for it and appreciate it. And it's up to us to keep it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, hear, hear. That's a really good point. Good thing to remember.
And I think I would echo that. I would go back to my point about young people, an engaged electorate, an engaged group who, you know, as we've all said to the point where it's almost a cliche, our grandkids asking, what were you thinking? Why didn't you take action? You could see these big threats coming out after us, not just climate change, but biodiversity, food security, water security. You know, you could see it happening. What were you doing? I think that makes me incredibly optimistic. Environmental protection is not a spectator sport. It is not something done by the EPA without earning the trust and almost the mandate of the American people. And your dad said that he wrote in Time magazine. He was actually writing for me, but he, you know, I used it, and you know, this past year when he passed, and said, you know, the most important thing the EPA can do is earn the trust of the American people when they are scared, when they are worried, when they are facing either an acute threat or a longer term one, the belief that there are people in the government whose job it is to protect their family's health, their environment, the place they love, the places they grew up in. It's incredibly powerful. And so we just have to rely on these young people to continue in the legacy of your dad.
Mm-hmm. That's wonderful.
Mary, Lisa has said that so eloquently. Yeah. I would add something a little lighter to this story. only twice in my life did I meet Richard Nixon, even though I worked in the Nixon White House for 2 years. And the second time was in New York, where he spoke sometime in the 90s at the Plaza Hotel. And I went up to him and he said, I recognize you. You're the EPA guy. He said, I'm an environmentalist. I set up EPA. And then he said, who was that first guy I sent over there? The guy with the funny name. You ever see him? And I said, Ruckelshaus. Yes, I do. He said, well, tell him hello for me if you see him. He did a great job. And I was looking at Nixon thinking, has he forgotten about the Saturday Night Massacre, or does it just not matter? And I thought, I'll take it. And I think your dad would too. I told him that story. He just harumphed.
Yeah, that is a pretty, another one for us to file away of interesting and very, like you said, it's great to end on a light note. And both of you, your sense of optimism and the reasons why is so important for us to carry away today, because we know, like you're saying, Lisa, we can, if we get out and do something about it, things will change. And Bill, your point about how we've seen how a strong-willed population and a regulatory agency that does it with heart, and like both of you said, builds trust, we can make a huge difference. So that's a wonderful message for our audience today. So thank you both very much, and we'll talk more in the Q&A.
Thanks, Mary.
Thank you to Mary, Bill, and Lisa for those insightful remarks and discussion. I want to thank all of you for taking the time to celebrate Bill, commemorate EPA, and support the center. If you're attending the live post-event Q&A with our special guests, you should have received instructions in your email. If you can't find them or they're not working, contact us at the phone, email, and text numbers provided for help. We can't wait to continue the conversation. But before you go, take time to watch the bonus video we have teed up, featuring tribute videos about Bill from last year's luncheon, from some of our remarkable advisory board members. Have a great rest of your day, and we hope to see or hear from you soon.
Bill Ruckelshaus and I met a long time ago and been pretty darn good friends ever since.
I've known Bill Ruckelshaus probably since the late 80s or the early 90s. I met him when I became the director of the Department of Ecology for the state of Washington.
I've known Bill about half my life, which is not long enough.
I've known Bill for 30 years since I arrived in Seattle.
You know, the first time I really got to know Bill was probably within a year after 9/11/2001.
I met him at Weyerhaeuser when he first came out here to work for Weyerhaeuser.
There are several things you can't miss about Bill. One is he's got a wonderful light touch.
He is a very fine gardener, and one of his specialties growing dahlias. You plant well, you nurture well, and you watch growth and give it some guidance. Stake up the plants that are tipping over, give them every opportunity to succeed. And I think he does the same thing in the many controversies he's been involved with. You let the people who are involved ultimately find their way to solutions. You give them guidance, but you don't demand solutions. You nurture them to gain solutions. It's the same way with Dad is. So Dad is in controversies in many respects the same thing.
In every situation, he can disarm it by coming in with his humor and his lightness. His presence is part of that. His enormous head, you may not have noticed, but Bill has an enormous head. I mean, most people are 7 1/4 or something, and Bill is 8 9/10 or something. And he's towering, and so his very presence is something. And then when he has this light touch, it's beguiling. It disarms you. You can't be mad at Bill.
He can do what no one else can, and he can do it in a way that no one else has the capability that he does. His stature, his demeanor, his affability, his wit, his brilliance, his ability to bring everyone together. I don't know of anybody else who can do that.
And in a way, that serious side of Bill is sometimes missed, but it's that serious side that leads Bill into doing things like the Ruckelshaus Center, because he thinks that people share that rational element that he has inside him, and that things can always be solved if you start working together and finding out what you have in common and then working out to the edges.
But what he does is he makes people at the table rise to a bigger level, to see how important it is for them to get over their past disagreements and solve problems and make things better for this and future generations. So we're all better off because of the work that he's done in the Ruckelshaus Center.
He has really brought the best of governance to the William D. Ruckelshaus Center. His impact will be far and wide because he really shows us that you can achieve consensus through collaboration, that you can bring parties who have never agreed before to the table, and you can actually get a durable result.
That is the beauty of the Ruckelshaus Center. That is the beauty of how the Ruckelshaus Center translates this capacity to bring disparate points of view together for common interests. That so epitomizes the beauty of Bill Ruckelshaus.
Well, I think America has these lasting values, and Bill has tried to represent those lasting values of how do you include all people. The world should be, and our country should be inclusive, not exclusive. How do you bring people together? How do you reach a consensus? Those type of things. And I watch young people. We work with young people all the time, and university programs and college programs trying to teach them how to be leaders in the future. And I don't have any doubts about it that those skills that Bill has demonstrated are the skills that young people need as they go through life.
Bill Ruckelshaus has really been an inspiration for generations of students and of leaders. He really is a perfect example of somebody who cares amazingly about the world.
We use the term elder statesmen, elder stateswomen, individuals that would rise above the political fray and look out for the betterment of the country or the state.
And I got to tell you, he is a model of public service. And thank goodness we all have him to look to and make ourselves proud, because public servants make an impact in the lives and the livelihood of the average citizen every single day. Bill Ruckelshaus did that masterfully, and he has shown us all to be proud of being a public servant, give it your all, and be successful, because you will then leave a legacy for generations to come.